I'm Ava Mercer, 32 years old, and I'm writing this a week after my life split cleanly down the middle. There was my life before, and there is my life now. Before, everything was built on anxious hope, hospital parking lots, and the kind of exhaustion that settles so deep into your bones you stop noticing it. Now everything feels colder, quieter, sharper. This is what remains when love turns out to be something else entirely. For 2 years, my world revolved around my mother's cancer. Stage 4, ovarian cancer. The kind of diagnosis that changes the color of every room you enter. The kind that turns ordinary Tuesdays into blood work, consultations, scans, and questions you are too afraid to ask unless you are ready for the answer. 5 years earlier, my father died and left behind a modest life insurance policy. I took that money and added a large portion of my own savings. Every bonus, every spare dollar, every plan I had for myself got redirected into one purpose: keeping my mother alive. We called it the Lifeline Fund. It held a little over $150,000 set aside for her care. Not vacation money, not house money, not some vague emergency reserve. It was there for one reason only: my mother. Anything insurance refused to cover: experimental treatment, home nursing if things got worse, recovery support if things improved, follow-up scans, maintenance drugs, a cushion against panic, a way to buy time in a fight that had already taken too much from her. That fund was sacred to me. And because I was trying to be practical, because I was juggling brutal hours at my engineering firm while managing appointments, bills, medication schedules, and my own fear, I made what I thought was a reasonable decision. I trusted my boyfriend. His name was Ryan Cole. We had been together for 4 years. He lived with me. He had sat beside me in waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. He had rubbed my back while I cried in hospital elevators. He had held my mother's hand and called her Eleanor, with a softness that made me believe he understood what it meant to love someone through illness. I thought we were building a life together. I thought he was safe. So I gave him a debit card linked to the Lifeline Fund. Only for emergencies, I told him. If my mother needed a payment handled while I was trapped in meetings, if a bill had to be paid quickly, if something urgent came up and I couldn't get to my phone, he could take care of it. That was the arrangement. That was the trust. At the time, it felt like a symbol of partnership. Proof that even in the worst chapter of my life, I wasn't carrying everything alone. Last Tuesday began as the best day I'd had in years. My mother and I were sitting in her oncologist's office waiting for the latest scan results. By then, I had learned to read rooms before anyone spoke. I knew the careful, neutral face doctors wore when they were about to soften a blow. I knew how my mother straightened her shoulders when she was bracing herself. I knew how to hold my breath without making it obvious. Then Dr. Levin walked in with a look I had never seen on him before. A smile. Not polite, not cautious. Real. He looked at my mother and said, "Eleanor, I don't say this lightly, but I don't know how else to say it. The tumors are gone. Your markers are non-existent. You're in complete remission." For a second, neither of us moved. It was like language had stopped making sense. Then my mother made this small sound, half laugh, half sob, and I reached for her. We both broke apart. I cried so hard I could barely breathe. She cried into my shoulder. 2 years of dread came pouring out in one violent, shaking wave. I had forgotten what relief felt like. I had forgotten that joy could hurt on its way in. Remission was not a cure. We both knew that. Cancer had already taught us not to be arrogant with hope, but remission meant a future. It meant more scans, more monitoring, more caution, yes, but it also meant birthdays. Coffee on her porch. Ordinary days. It meant the Lifeline Fund still mattered, maybe more than ever. Not as funeral money, not as money waiting for an ending. As protection for the next 5 years. For vigilance. For the next chapter she had actually lived long enough to reach. I drove home in a daze. I stopped for champagne. I bought my mother's favorite pastries. I remember smiling at strangers. I remember feeling, for the first time in so long, that maybe life was finally about to unclench. I couldn't wait to tell Ryan. I walked into our apartment with the champagne tucked against my side and the pastry box balanced in one hand. "Ryan," I called, breathless with joy. "You are not going to believe this. She's in remission, complete remission." He was standing in the kitchen. And the second he turned around, something inside me went cold. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look relieved. He looked trapped. That was the only word for it. Not sad, not confused, trapped. The blood had drained from his face so completely he looked sick. His hands flexed at his sides. His eyes kept skittering away from mine, like there was somewhere in the room he wished he could disappear into. The champagne bottle slipped in my grip. My happiness didn't vanish all at once. It curdled. "What is it?" I asked. He swallowed. "Ava." The way he said my name made my pulse stutter. I set the pastries on the counter very carefully. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming behind him. "What is it?" I asked again. He looked at the floor. "About the fund." That was all it took. It is strange how fast the body can recognize catastrophe before the mind catches up. My skin prickled. My hands went numb. I stared at him and, for 1 second, I genuinely couldn't understand the sentence I had just heard. "What about the fund?" He dragged a hand over his mouth. "I can explain." My voice came out thin and dangerous. "Then explain." What followed did not sound like a confession from a man crushed by shame. It sounded like a coward trying to arrange his excuses in real time. He told me he had started a business, an online boutique. He said he saw an opportunity and needed capital for inventory, branding, a website, digital marketing, launch costs. He kept using words like temporary and phrases like, "I was going to put it back," as if that could clean any of this up. I stood there with the neck of a warming champagne bottle in my hand, while he admitted, in fragments and evasions, that he had used the Lifeline Fund. Not some of it. All of it. I don't remember setting the bottle down, but I must have, because suddenly both my hands were empty and hanging uselessly at my sides. "All of it?" I repeated. His eyes flickered up to mine, then away. "I was going to pay it back." My hearing sharpened until everything else disappeared. The hum of the refrigerator, a car outside, my own breathing. "How much, Ryan?" He said nothing. "How much?" His silence answered before he did. "Everything." The room seemed to tilt beneath me. I had spent 2 years living on caffeine and fear, driving my mother to appointments, arguing with insurers, pretending optimism when she was too exhausted to lift her head. And all that time, the man sleeping beside me had been siphoning money out of the one thing I had built to keep her alive. "When?" I asked. He started talking too quickly, like speed could turn filth into logic. The boutique had started months ago. He needed inventory first, then the site, then advertising, then a consultant. He kept believing the next expense would be the one that made it take off. He said he wanted to build something for us. He said he wanted to secure our future. Our future. I looked at him and realized, with a kind of sick clarity, that he had been using the language of partnership while quietly feeding off my mother's decline. "You stole from my mother," I said. "No, Ava, that's not—" "You stole from my mother." His face tightened. Then, because there are sentences that reveal a soul so completely they leave nothing left to argue with, he said the one thing that burned away whatever was left of the person I thought I knew. "I thought she was dying anyway." For a second, I just stared at him. He kept going, maybe because he mistook my silence for uncertainty, maybe because some monstrous part of him still believed this could be framed as practical. "The doctor said 6 months, maybe a year," he said. "The prognosis was terrible. I thought if the worst happened, at least something good could come out of it. I thought I could build something for us instead of just letting all that money sit there." As if it had been idle. As if it had not been oxygen. As if my mother had already become a countdown in his head. A closing window. A number to plan around. Something in me stopped hurting. Not because it mattered less. Because it became simpler. There are moments when grief freezes into something cleaner, harder. A blade instead of a wound. When I heard my own voice, it sounded calm in a way that frightened even me. "Actually, Ryan," I said, "she's in remission." He blinked. "What?" "She's in remission," I repeated. "Complete remission." His mouth parted slightly. For one ridiculous second, he looked confused, as if he had forgotten that my mother was a real person whose body could still produce outcomes that disrupted his plans. "But that's good," he said weakly. "Right?" I took a step back from him. "No," I said. Not for you. He stared at me. I think that was the moment he realized I wasn't going to cry or bargain or ask how he could do this to me. He had prepared for emotional chaos, maybe even forgiveness after enough tears. What he had not prepared for was the total absence of it. You seem confused about what that money was, I said. That fund was never money waiting for an ending. It was for the next 5 years of scans, maintenance drugs, tests, complications, the risk of recurrence. You didn't just spend money because you thought my mother was going to die. You gutted the margin, protecting her future because you decided it mattered less than yours. His face had gone white. Ava, please. I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. The second he saw it, fear finally landed. What are you doing? I unlocked the screen and looked him in the eye. My mother is 65 years old, I said. She is a cancer patient. You were in a position of trust. You had emergency access to money designated for her care. You drained it under the assumption that she would be dead soon enough for it not to matter. He took a step toward me. Please don't do this. That is not a relationship problem, Ryan. My thumb moved to the keypad. That is a felony. He went completely still. Ava, financial elder abuse, I said. Grand theft, too, I imagine. The district attorney can sort out the exact wording. He started shaking his head before I even dialed. It was a mistake. We can fix it. I can get investors. I can sell the business. I can call people. Please, don't call the police. Please. I believed then more than ever that he had never expected real consequence. Just fallout. Anger. A breakup, maybe. The kind of damage he thought he could survive as long as he stayed the injured party in his own story. I pressed call. He made a sound then. Not remorse. Panic. I gave the dispatcher my name, my address, and the facts. I heard how flat my voice was and barely recognized it. I reported unauthorized depletion of funds belonging to an elderly cancer patient by a trusted domestic partner. I reported the amount. I reported the access point. I reported that the suspect was still present but preparing to leave. Ryan looked like he might collapse. When the call ended, I told him to put his keys on the counter. All of them. He stared at me. The apartment key, the mailbox key, the storage key. His lips trembled. Ava. And the phone, too, I said. It's on my family plan. That, strangely, seemed to humiliate him more than anything else. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, then stopped when he saw my face. Whatever softness he had counted on was gone. He put the keys down one by one, then the phone. The tiny clicks of metal against stone sounded far louder than they should have. He grabbed his wallet and his jacket. At the door, he turned back as if there might still be some version of me standing there who loved him enough to call this off. There wasn't. He left. The apartment went silent. The champagne was still on the counter. The pastry box sat unopened beside it. A celebration cooling into evidence. I stood there in the center of the kitchen we had once called ours, and realized my life had already divided itself in two, before I knew what he was, and after. The police arrived within the hour. By then I had cleaned nothing. I hadn't touched the champagne, hadn't moved the pastry box, hadn't picked Ryan's keys up off the counter. The apartment still looked like a celebration interrupted by a crime scene. 2 officers came in quietly, the kind of quiet people use when they already know something ugly is waiting inside. I gave my statement at the kitchen island while one of them took notes, and the other reviewed the account details I had pulled up on my laptop. I told them about the Lifeline Fund. I told them it existed solely for my mother's treatment and long-term care. I told them Ryan had emergency access only for her medical needs. Then I told them what he had confessed. Not every word. Just the ones that mattered. He thought she was dying anyway. Even repeating it out loud made something twist inside me. One of the officers, a woman with tired eyes and a steady voice, paused for half a second when I said it. Not long enough to be called a reaction. Just long enough for me to know she understood exactly how vile it was. They gave me a case number. They told me someone from the Financial Crimes Unit would contact me. They also said that because my mother was over 65 and medically vulnerable, the report would likely trigger a referral to Adult Protective Services. When they left, the apartment felt even quieter than before. I finally picked up the champagne and put it in the fridge, not because I still wanted to celebrate, because I couldn't stand looking at it warm on the counter beside the outline of what my life had been that morning. The next day, I got the first call from Detective Aaron Miller. His voice sounded worn in the way some voices do when they've spent too many years listening to excuses. He didn't waste time softening anything. He told me he had reviewed the initial report and needed documentation, full account history, dates, amounts, proof of the stated purpose of the fund, any written communication showing Ryan knew exactly what the money was for. By noon, Adult Protective Services had called too. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like private devastation and became something procedural, official. Forms, statements, timelines, evidence chains, follow-ups. I was no longer just a woman whose boyfriend had betrayed her. I was a witness, the primary witness, as it turned out. I took the rest of the week off work and turned my dining table into a command center. I pulled every statement from the Lifeline Fund going back a year. At first, I thought maybe there was some chance, absurd but human, that he had exaggerated. That maybe it wasn't all gone. Maybe there were chunks missing, but not everything. Maybe there would still be enough left to salvage some part of the future I had been guarding for my mother. There wasn't. The theft had not happened in one reckless plunge. It happened the way rot happens, quietly, methodically. The first suspicious withdrawal was 8 months earlier, right after one of my mother's worst oncology appointments. I remembered that week vividly because her scans had shown new growth and I had cried in the parking garage after pretending to be strong in the office. 3 days later, $10,000 had left the account. Then another transfer. Then another. $5,000 for web design. $7,000 for inventory. $15,000 for a marketing consultant. $3,000 here. $12,000 there. Amounts spaced just far enough apart that if you weren't looking closely, you could mistake the damage for normal account movement. It wasn't chaotic spending. It was a slow bleed, carefully paced. I sat there staring at the spreadsheet until the numbers blurred. Every line item felt like a memory being poisoned after the fact. That weekend, he had taken my mother's soup when she was too nauseated to cook. He had also moved money. That night, he held me while I panicked about her next scan. He had also moved money. That morning, he kissed my forehead and told me we were going to get through this. He had probably already spent part of her future on branded packaging and ad targeting. I found the business next. Nova Bloom Boutique. Even the name made me want to laugh and throw up at the same time. It was exactly the kind of online store that exists by the thousands. Polished on the surface, hollow underneath. Trend jewelry, fast fashion accessories, generic copy trying to sound luxurious, a pastel logo, a mission statement about empowering women through style, which would have been funny if it hadn't been built on stolen cancer money. Ryan had used our shared cloud storage for convenience, and either arrogance or stupidity had made him careless. His invoices were there, vendor emails, website setup receipts, digital ad reports, correspondence with a freelance brand consultant who called the launch promising. I downloaded everything, printed everything, labeled everything. By the second day, I had a binder. By the third, I had 2. Bank statements in chronological order, account transfers highlighted, screenshots of vendor payments, emails discussing launch timelines, proof that the money was being funneled directly into Nova Bloom and nowhere near anything resembling medical necessity. I also pulled old texts between us, the ones I had never expected to matter in a courtroom. Transferred another $5,000 to the Lifeline Fund for your mom's next treatment cycle. I'm leaving the card in the kitchen drawer in case Eleanor's meds need to be picked up while I'm in meetings. Don't use that account unless it's for my mom. Ever. That one made me stop. I had sent it 6 months earlier. Clear, explicit, unambiguous. I read it 3 times, then printed it and slid it into the front of the binder. When Detective Miller came by, he looked through the first section, then the second, then leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. This, he said, tapping the tabbed dividers, is very organized. I almost apologized for that. Instead, I said, I needed to do something. He nodded like he understood that better than I wanted him to. He took the binders with him and told me plainly that this kind of documentation mattered. Emergency access did not equal permission. A card did not change purpose. Context mattered. Written records mattered. He didn't promise outcomes, but for the first time since Ryan's confession, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope, something sturdier, direction. Telling my mother was harder than calling the police, harder than reading the statements, harder than hearing Ryan's voice in my head every time I saw another transfer. I drove to her house on Sunday afternoon with one of the binders in my passenger seat and a knot in my chest so tight it made breathing feel deliberate. My mother was sitting in her sunroom when I arrived, wrapped in a light cardigan, even though the day was warm. She looked better than she had in months, stronger somehow, since the remission news. There was color in her face again, a softness around her mouth that hadn't been there during treatment. Seeing that nearly broke me before I even sat down. "Ava?" she said the second I walked in. "What happened?" Mothers know. Even after everything illness had taken from her, that instinct was untouched. I sat across from her and told her the truth, not all at once. I couldn't. I gave it to her in pieces, about the account, about Ryan, about the business, about the withdrawals, about how long it had been happening, about what he said when I confronted him. I expected anger, or tears, or the kind of grief that comes with being betrayed by someone you let into the family. Instead, my mother went very still. She folded her hands in her lap and stared out the window for a long moment, not because she was avoiding me, but because she was making room inside herself for something ugly. When she finally looked back at me, her eyes were wet, but her voice was soft. "Oh, Ava," she said, "that poor broken man." I blinked at her, not because I disagreed, because I hadn't expected mercy to arrive before rage did. "I'm not sad about the money first," she said. "We'll find a way. We always do. I'm sad that someone could stand so close to suffering and come away emptier instead of kinder." I looked down because suddenly my own eyes were burning. "He called you family," I whispered. She gave me a sad, tired smile. Then he never understood the word. That was my mother, even now. Even after chemo had hollowed her body and fear had narrowed her life, she still managed to grieve the condition of his soul before she grieved the theft itself. And somehow that didn't make me softer. It made me surer, because she deserved better than private damage control, better than some desperate agreement reached in silence, better than letting him fail upward into a version of the story where this had all been a misunderstanding between adults. No, he had done something real. He had done something prosecutable, and I was going to see it named correctly. A week after my first call, Detective Miller phoned again. They had arrested Ryan at his sister's house just after 7 that morning. I said thank you and hung up, then stood in my kitchen with the phone still in my hand, waiting to feel something cinematic. Vindication, triumph, relief. What I felt was smaller and stranger than that. Finality, like a door had shut somewhere far down a hallway. Apparently, Ryan had been stunned. That was the detective's word. Stunned. As if some part of him had genuinely believed he would talk his way around this. As if access to my life had made him think he also had access to immunity. Then the calls from his family started. The first was his mother. I almost didn't answer, but I did, and the second I heard her voice, I knew I should have let it ring out. "How could you do this?" she demanded. No hello, no Ava. Just accusation. "Ryan made a mistake. He got in over his head. He was trying to build something. You've ruined his life over money." I stood at the sink and stared at the dark window above it. "Over money?" I repeated. "You know what I mean." "No," I said quietly. "I really don't." She huffed out a sound of disgust. "Your mother had cancer. You, of all people, should understand how much pressure everyone was under." I actually laughed once, not because it was funny, because the sentence was so obscene my body needed somewhere to put the shock of hearing it. "My mother had cancer," I said, each word flat and precise. "That is exactly why your son should have kept his hands off her care fund." "He loved you." "No," I said. "He loved access." Silence. Then, sharper, "You are destroying his future." I looked at the stack of printed statements on the counter, the highlighted transfers. The dates lined up against scan results, the months of quiet theft hidden under domestic routine. "Your son gambled with my mother's life," I said. "The fact that you can reduce that to a mistake tells me everything I need to know." She started talking over me, voice rising, but I ended the call. Then I blocked her number. His sister texted an hour later, pleading for compassion. His cousin sent a message saying Ryan was ashamed and wanted a chance to explain. A family friend wrote a long paragraph about grace and second chances and not ruining a good man over one terrible decision. One terrible decision. As if this had happened in a minute. As if it had not taken 8 months. As if every transfer had not been its own decision. I blocked them too. The system had started moving. Slowly, yes. But with weight. And for the first time since my life split in two, I understood that grief and action could coexist. I could miss the man I thought Ryan was and still make sure the man he actually was faced the consequences of what he'd done. I had done my part. Now I had to trust that what came next would not be softened into something smaller than the truth. By the time the district attorney's office formally filed charges, I had stopped expecting anything to feel dramatic. No thunder. No cinematic rush, just emails, court dates, document requests, a calendar that now carried two kinds of survival on it, my mother's follow-up oncology appointments, and the legal machinery built around the man who had decided her suffering was usable. The charges were serious: grand theft, financial elder abuse. The second one hit differently when I first saw it written in black and white. Elder abuse. That was what this was. Not a bad breakup. Not a misunderstanding over shared finances, not a messy dispute between exes. Abuse. Calculated exploitation of someone vulnerable. The victim was not me. That distinction mattered more than ever now. My mother was at the center of the case, even if I was the one who uncovered it, documented it, and reported it. The money existed for her care. Ryan's access had been granted because of her condition. The betrayal was personal to me, yes, but legally and morally, he had preyed on her. We met with the prosecutor 3 weeks after his arrest. Her name was Assistant District Attorney Vivian Chen, and she was the kind of woman who made you sit straighter without trying. Calm, precise, unimpressed by theatrics. She greeted my mother with real respect, shook my hand, then opened a thick case file and began walking us through what came next. She didn't oversell anything. She didn't promise easy outcomes or triumphant courtroom speeches. She told us what the law required, where the defense would push, what evidence mattered, and what the state intended to prove. Cases like this often get reframed by the defense as private financial disputes, she said, especially when there is a romantic relationship involved. They will likely try to blur consent, access, and intent until it sounds like nothing more than a breakup with money attached to it. My mother sat very still, hands folded over her purse. "And will that work?" she asked quietly. Ms. Chen looked at her for a moment, then at me. "Not with these records," she said. I felt something inside me loosen. Not because it was over, because I finally understood the shape of the battle. Ryan's public defender made his strategy clear almost immediately. He was going to drag this into the mud of intimacy and hope ambiguity would do what innocence couldn't. According to his filings, Ryan had not stolen anything. He had used funds from an account he had authorized access to as part of what he understood to be a shared future. The money, they argued, had gone into a business intended to benefit both of us. My report to police, in their version, was revenge dressed up as law. The elder abuse statute, they implied, was being weaponized by a bitter woman punishing an ex-boyfriend. When Ms. Chen summarized that argument for us, I actually felt insulted on behalf of reality. Not because it was surprising, because it was so shamelessly neat. It depended on reducing everything into one polished lie: emergency access, a shared household, a boyfriend with a card, a business for the future, a breakup, retaliation. If you stripped away the context, it almost sounded plausible. So the state did the opposite. It built the context into a wall. Ms. Chen's team subpoenaed texts, emails, account records, and cloud-stored documents. They didn't need a dramatic confession on tape. They already had something stronger: pattern and purpose. There were my texts. Transferred another $5,000 to the Lifeline Fund for my mom's next treatment cycle. Don't use that card unless it's for Eleanor's care. I moved more money into the fund in case the next scans lead to a new medication plan. There were emails referencing the fund by name. There were hospital-related payment notes. There were discussions about insurance gaps and maintenance drugs if my mother entered remission. Everywhere the defense tried to create vagueness, the records restored specificity. This was not a general nest egg, not a household operating account, not a venture pool. It was a medical support fund for a vulnerable older adult fighting cancer. Ryan had known that, repeatedly, explicitly. The more evidence they pulled, the uglier the timeline became. That was the part Ms. Chen said would matter most. She had her team assemble a large side-by-side chronology. On one side were my mother's oncology events, scan results, treatment changes, worsening prognosis notes, emergency symptom spikes. On the other side were Ryan's withdrawals and transfers into Nova Bloom Boutique. 10,000 after disease progression, 7,000 after a severe treatment complication, 15,000 after the appointment where doctors use phrases like limited response and guarded outlook. Every time my mother's future appeared more fragile, Ryan's spending became bolder. He had not made one desperate choice. He had interpreted decline as timing. When Ms. Chen laid the chart across the conference table, even without a courtroom around it, it made the air feel thinner. My mother looked at it for a long moment, then closed her eyes. I reached for her hand. She squeezed mine once, opened her eyes again, and kept looking. Not away from it, at it. That quiet strength of hers was beginning to change me in ways I couldn't fully name. Before this, I would have thought courage meant fire, raising your voice, refusing to back down loudly. But my mother's version of courage was steadier. She looked directly at what hurt and refused to let it rename itself into anything easier. That chart did exactly what Ryan had never expected anyone to do. It translated his character into sequence. He was not a misunderstood entrepreneur. He was a man who accelerated his theft when my mother looked closer to death. The plea offer came 2 months later. Ms. Chen told us she had offered Ryan a deal. Plead guilty to both charges, accept responsibility, and the state would recommend 4 years. Not mercy, exactly. More a narrowing of damage in exchange for not forcing a frail cancer survivor through trial. He refused, immediately. No hesitation, no counter, no meaningful remorse. I remember staring at Ms. Chen when she told us that. He refused? I asked. She nodded once. His position remains that he did nothing criminal. I laughed under my breath, but there was no humor in it. Of course he had refused, because accepting the plea would have required the one thing Ryan had spent his whole adult life avoiding, naming himself honestly. Ambitious was the word he preferred. Misunderstood, pressured, cornered, underestimated, maybe even loving if the audience was gullible enough. But guilty, predatory, exploitative? No. He would rather gamble on a courtroom than wear a word that actually fit. Ms. Chen leaned back slightly in her chair. He appears to believe he'll present well to a jury, she said. Your former partner seems very invested in his own likability. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was clever, because it was exact. Ryan had always believed presentation could rescue substance, a calm tone over a lie, soft eyes over selfishness, the right story at the right moment. He thought sincerity was a performance skill, not a condition of character. It had probably worked for him more times than I would ever know. It would not work here. Still, as the trial approached, fear got in. At night, mostly. In those minutes when the house went still and my own mind became the loudest thing in it, I would lie awake thinking about juries and doubt and the strange flexibility of truth once lawyers begin stretching it under fluorescent lights. I imagined Ryan crying on the stand. I imagined some polished lie landing well. I imagined one sympathetic juror deciding that access meant permission, that love excused theft, that wanting a future softened the ugliness of how he chose to fund it. Once, after a sleepless night, I drove to my mother's house before work just to sit with her for 20 minutes. She was at the kitchen table in slippers, drinking tea and reading with her glasses low on her nose. When she saw my face, she closed the book immediately. You didn't sleep, she said. I shook my head and sat down across from her. What if he talks his way out of it? I asked. What if they make it sound complicated enough that no one wants to see it clearly? She stirred honey into her tea. Then she looked at me with the kind of quiet that had steadied me since childhood. The truth does not become weaker because someone dishonest is fluent, she said. I felt tears push into my eyes so suddenly I had to look away. She reached across the table and touched my wrist. Ava, she said softly, you are afraid of spectacle. That's understandable. But courtrooms are not built only for whoever speaks the smoothest. Sometimes they are built for records, for patterns, for the simple fact that actions leave shapes behind. That became my private refrain through the weeks that followed. Every filing, every preparation session, every question Ms. Chen asked me before testimony, she prepped me carefully, and in a way, I came to appreciate more than any comfort. She didn't tell me to sound strong. She told me to sound true. Answer what is asked. Do not volunteer to fill silence. Do not argue with defense counsel. Do not try to persuade the jury through emotion. Let the facts carry their own weight. That was harder than it sounded. Not because I wanted to dramatize anything, because when you have lived inside betrayal, the facts themselves feel emotional. The morning before the hearing, I ran into Ryan for the first time since the arrest. Not alone. In the hallway outside a conference room with his attorney beside him, he looked thinner, not broken, not remorseful, just strained in a way that suggested inconvenience had finally become real. He had on a navy suit I had bought with him for a wedding the year before, and seeing it on him nearly made me smile at the grotesque smallness of what my mind noticed under stress. He saw me and stopped. So did I. For 1 second, the whole hallway seemed to narrow around us. His attorney murmured something and stepped slightly aside, maybe to give him a moment, maybe because she understood this was the kind of interaction no lawyer can fully control. Ava, he said. My name in his mouth felt stale. I said nothing. His eyes moved over my face like he was searching for a version of me he still recognized. Something softer, more reachable. I never wanted this. I looked at him and thought, with perfect clarity, that this was the first honest thing he had said since all of this began. Of course he never wanted this. He wanted the money, the access, the narrative, the benefit, not the consequences. You wanted the withdrawals, I said. You just didn't want a witness. His face flinched. For a moment, anger flashed there, quick, ugly, unguarded. Then it was gone, replaced by something pleading. You're acting like I wanted your mother hurt. No, I said. I'm acting like you decided her risk was acceptable. That landed. I saw it. Because unlike his lawyer's arguments, that sentence could not be untangled. It named the exact thing he had done. He had looked at my mother's illness, calculated proximity to death, and treated the danger to her care as acceptable collateral. His attorney stepped back in then, cool and efficient, and guided him away. He didn't say goodbye. Neither did I. That afternoon, I sat beside my mother in a courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper and air conditioning and listened as the state began laying out what Ryan had done in language that no longer belonged to me alone. For the first time, the facts were being carried by something bigger than my voice. And the more they were spoken aloud, the less this resembled heartbreak. It looked exactly like what it had always been, a crime. The trial began on a Wednesday morning, under the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel already decided. I remember standing outside the courthouse with my mother before we went in. She had one hand looped through my arm, her fingers light but steady against my sleeve. She looked smaller than she had before cancer, softer at the edges in a way illness sometimes leaves behind even after the scans improve. But there was steel in her too, not loud steel, the kind that endures. Are you all right? I asked her. She gave me a look that was almost amused. No, she said, but I'm here. That was answer enough. Inside, the courtroom was colder than I expected. Literally cold. The air conditioning hummed overhead, and the wooden benches carried that old institutional chill that never seems to leave. Ryan was already there with his attorney when we entered. He stood when the judge came in, sat when told, and kept his face arranged in a careful expression I recognized immediately. Composed, sober, respectable. He looked like a man auditioning for leniency. I hated that I knew the mechanics of his face so well. Hated that I could tell when he was performing calm and when he was actually feeling it. The version of him sitting at the defense table had been curated for strangers. Dark suit, understated tie, no arrogance visible from a distance. If you knew nothing, you might have thought he was the wrong man in the wrong place. But I knew too much. Opening statements were restrained, which somehow made them hit harder. Ryan's attorney framed him exactly the way we had expected. A man in over his head, involved in a relationship where emotional and financial boundaries had blurred, now facing the machinery of the state, because grief and a breakup had curdled into accusation. She used phrases like misunderstanding, shared future, implied consent. She polished him into someone earnest enough to deserve confusion instead of condemnation. Then Ms. Chen stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not act offended on our behalf. She simply laid out the facts in sequence so clear they sounded inevitable. A vulnerable older adult with cancer. A designated fund created for her treatment and continuing care. A trusted younger man given emergency access for medical needs only. A pattern of withdrawals aligned with periods of medical decline. A private confession. A motive rooted not in survival or panic, but in opportunity. By the time she sat down, the room felt smaller. The state called bank representatives first, then the detective, then a forensic analyst who walked the jury through the account timeline with clinical precision. I watched the jurors' faces as line after line of transfers appeared on the screen. Most stayed neutral in the way jurors are trained to do. But neutrality is not invisibility. I could see when a note was written a little harder, when someone leaned closer, when a head tilted slightly at the date of a withdrawal landing just days after one of my mother's worst oncology reports. Then it was her turn. I had dreaded that moment from the beginning. Not because I thought she would fall apart, because I knew she wouldn't. The bailiff helped her to the stand, and she settled into the witness chair with a quiet dignity that made the room seem to correct its own posture around her. She wore a pale blue blouse and the silver earrings my father had given her on their 20th anniversary. I hadn't seen her wear them in months, maybe longer. The sight of them nearly undid me. Ms. Chen approached gently. "Would you please state your name for the record?" "My name is Eleanor Mercer." "And Ms. Mercer, do you know the defendant?" My mother looked at Ryan. Not long, just long enough. "Yes," she said. "He was my daughter's boyfriend." Was. The smallest words can do the cleanest cutting. Ms. Chen asked her about the Lifeline Fund, about her diagnosis, about how the money was intended to cover treatment, scans, medication, home support, and any expense insurance would not. My mother answered plainly, no embellishment, no dramatic pauses, just truth, set down carefully. Then Ms. Chen asked the question I had been dreading most. "How did you view Mr. Cole before learning the money was gone?" Something changed in my mother's face then. Not collapse, just sorrow rising to the surface. "I trusted him," she said. "I loved him. Not as a son exactly, because he wasn't my son, but he was welcome in my life in that way. He was family adjacent, someone I believe cared what happened to me." It was such a graceful phrase for something so broken that I saw one of the jurors look up sharply from her notes. "And what did that fund mean to you?" Ms. Chen asked. My mother folded her hands together in her lap. "It meant time," she said. "Not guaranteed time, but the chance to keep fighting without every new development becoming a financial emergency. It meant that if the cancer came back, or if remission required maintenance I couldn't afford, my daughter and I would not have to face that from nothing." Her voice never shook. Mine nearly did just listening. Ms. Chen let the answer settle before asking, "And when you learned the money had been used for the defendant's business?" For the first time, my mother's eyes looked older than I had ever seen them. "I was heartsick," she said, "not only because of the money, because of what it required in him, to watch someone be ill and convert that into permission." There was a silence after that line so complete I could hear fabric shifting as someone in the jury box moved. Ryan's attorney cross-examined her carefully, almost delicately, as if pushing too hard against a woman like my mother would repel the room. She tried to suggest that because Ryan had been close to our family, the boundaries around the fund may have become informal, that perhaps conversations had happened casually, without everyone using precise language, that maybe Ryan had believed he was acting within a looser understanding. My mother listened. Then she answered in the same calm voice she had used throughout. "Access is not the same as permission," she said. Ryan's attorney smiled the way lawyers do when they want to pretend an answer helped them more than it did. "Of course, but relationships can create assumptions, can't they?" "Yes," my mother said, "and assumptions reveal character." That one was quieter, but it landed harder. When my mother stepped down from the stand, I wanted to run to her. Instead, I sat still and breathed through the ache in my chest while the next witness was called. The court recessed for lunch not long after, and the second we reached the hallway, I took both her hands in mine. "You were incredible," I whispered. She gave me that same faint, tired smile. I was truthful. Then it was my turn. I took the stand that afternoon with my heart pounding hard enough to make the courtroom edges feel overdefined. Ms. Chen had told me to keep my answers clean. Let the facts do the work. Don't narrate pain the evidence already proves. I held on to that like a railing. She started with basics: my name, my age, my profession, my relationship to Eleanor Mercer, my relationship to Ryan Cole. Then she walked me through the creation of the Lifeline Fund, the source of the money, its purpose, the reason Ryan had been given emergency access, and the explicit limits on that access. I answered steadily. Every now and then, I could feel Ryan looking at me, but I refused to look back. Then Ms. Chen said, "I'd like to direct your attention to the day you received good news from your mother's doctor." My throat tightened instantly, not because I couldn't answer. Because until that moment, the legal process had required me to carry facts more than feelings. But that day still lived in me, with all its contrast intact. Joy so bright it almost hurt, followed by betrayal so grotesque it seemed to bleach the room around it. I told the jury about the remission appointment, about Dr. Levin smiling, about my mother crying, about buying champagne and pastries on the way home, about walking into the apartment full of gratitude and relief, only to find Ryan in the kitchen, looking like a man already standing at the edge of exposure. Ms. Chen asked, "What did the defendant say to you about the account?" I repeated the confession in substance first. The boutique, the withdrawals, the claim that he intended to repay the money, the months of spending, his insistence that he was trying to build something for our future. Then she paused and said, "Did he make any statement about your mother's condition that day?" I felt every eye in the room sharpen. "Yes," I said. "What did he say?" For 1 second, I was back in my kitchen. The pastry box, the cooling champagne, his face, my own body learning in real time that love and danger can occupy the same room until one finally names itself. I looked at the prosecutor, not at the defense table. He said that he thought she was dying anyway. A juror in the second row physically flinched. Not dramatically, just enough. And once I saw it, I knew the sentence had landed exactly where it should, not as rhetoric, but as evidence of who he was when he thought honesty still might save him. Ms. Chen did not crowd the moment. She let the silence breathe, then asked what I had done next. I told him my mother was in remission, I said. Then I amazed him in what the fund was actually for, the next 5 years of scans, treatment, and protection against recurrence. I said this wasn't a relationship dispute, it was a felony. Then I called the police. Cross-examination was uglier. Not because defense counsel was loud, because she was smooth. She tried to make me sound controlling. Asked whether Ryan had ever expressed frustration over financial dependence. Asked whether we discussed building a future together. Asked whether I had ever encouraged him to be ambitious. Asked whether it was possible I knew more about Nova Bloom than I was admitting. "No," I said. "No. No." Each answer felt like placing a brick. Then she shifted. "Ms. Mercer, isn't it true that you were devastated by the end of this relationship?" The question itself annoyed me. Not because it was unexpected, but because it assumed devastation and criminality were mutually exclusive. "I was devastated by what I learned about the defendant," I said. She tilted her head. "That wasn't my question. I know." For the first time, a tiny current moved through the courtroom. Not chaos, attention. She tried again. "You were angry." "Yes," I said. "I was." "And you called the police while emotional." I called the police after the defendant admitted he had drained a medical care fund belonging to a vulnerable cancer patient. That was the problem with staying close to the truth. Even hostile questions started carrying my case for me. By the time I stepped down, my palms were damp and my back ached from holding tension so rigidly. But I also knew something had shifted. Not in me. In the room. The defense narrative still existed, but it was shrinking. Every clean fact tightened the available space around it. Then Ryan took the stand. I had wondered, privately, whether his attorney would let him. Ms. Chen clearly expected they would, because his whole defense relied on his ability to package himself in person. Still, Seeing him walk to the witness chair felt surreal. Like watching someone step willingly into weather he had badly misread. He was polished at first, measured. He said he loved me, said he cared deeply for my mother, said he never intended harm, said he believed the money would be restored once the business succeeded. He described Nova Bloom as an opportunity, our future, a temporary use of funds during a period of emotional strain. He even managed, for several minutes, to sound almost plausible if you ignored structure and sequence and memory. Then Ms. Chen stood for cross. She began softly. "Mr. Cole, when Miss Mercer gave you access to the Lifeline Fund, what reason did she provide?" He shifted, in case something came up. "What kind of something?" "A need, an emergency." "For whom?" He hesitated. "Her mother." Ms. Chen nodded once. "And not for you." "It wasn't like that." "That wasn't my question," he swallowed. "No." Then she walked him, one document at a time, through the texts. "Don't use that card unless it's for my mom. Money for Eleanor's next treatment cycle. Need to build the fund back up before her next scan." She asked whether he received those messages. Yes. Whether he understood them. Yes. Whether he ever responded by saying he believed the money could also be used for his business. No. The word no started to wear on him. I could see it. Each answer stripped another layer off the version of himself he had hoped to present. Then came the timeline board, the same chronology we had seen in prep, now enlarged for the jury. Ms. Chen moved to it and pointed. "This $10,000 withdrawal," she said, 3 days after new growth was detected in Eleanor Mercer's scan. Coincidence? Ryan's jaw tightened. It was when I had to pay a vendor. And this $7,000 transfer here, the week she experienced severe treatment complications. I was under pressure. Answer the question. He blinked. Yes. And this $15,000 marketing payment, that came right after doctors documented a guarded outlook for her prognosis, correct? He looked at the board, then away from it. Yes. No flourish was needed. The chart was doing the work by itself. Ms. Chen stepped closer. "You testified that you intended no harm," she said, "but your withdrawals increased when her condition worsened, didn't they?" He said nothing. "Mr. Cole?" "Yes." "Because you believed time was running out." His face changed then. Not much, but enough. Enough for me to see the fracture under the polish. "I thought," he started, "yes or no?" He looked toward the jury as if likability might still save him. "Yes." The courtroom went very still. Then Ms. Chen asked the final question that mattered. "And when Ms. Mercer told you her mother was in remission, were you relieved for Eleanor Mercer or afraid for yourself?" He didn't answer fast enough. That was answer enough. When court adjourned that day, I walked out feeling not victorious, but emptied. Like the facts had finally been spoken so fully, there was nothing left in me to help carry them. The jury began deliberating the next morning. They were out for less than 2 hours, and everyone in the courtroom knew what that meant before they ever came back in. When the jury returned, the room didn't shift. It settled. That was the strangest part. No spike of tension, no dramatic inhale across the benches, just a quiet tightening, like everyone present already understood what the short deliberation meant, but still had to sit through the formality of hearing it spoken aloud. Ryan stood when the clerk instructed him to. So did I. So did my mother. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the jury. There were 12 of them, but in that moment they felt like one steady presence. Not emotional, not vindictive, just resolved. On the count of grand theft, the clerk read, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. There it was, a word so simple it almost seemed too small for what it carried. Guilty. The second count followed. On the charge of financial elder abuse, guilty. A soft sound broke somewhere behind the defense table. Someone in Ryan's family, I think. A stifled gasp that turned into a whisper. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see their faces to know what they looked like. Shock. Not at what he had done. At the fact that it had finally been named correctly. Ryan didn't react immediately. For a second, he just stood there, as if the word had reached him but hadn't yet been processed. Then his shoulders dropped, just slightly, and whatever performance he had been holding together cracked at the edges. Not dramatically, just enough. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them, and set the date for sentencing 2 weeks later. After everything that had already happened, that stretch of time felt surreal. The case was over, but not finished. The facts had been established, but the consequence hadn't yet been assigned. Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of small, quiet routines. I went back to work. My mother resumed her follow-up schedule. Life, stubborn as ever, kept moving forward even while part of it remained suspended inside a courtroom calendar. We didn't talk about Ryan much. Not because it didn't matter anymore, because the damage was already fully formed. Repeating it wouldn't change its shape. The morning of sentencing, the sky was clear. It felt almost inappropriate. My mother wore the same blue blouse she had worn when she testified. I didn't ask why. I think we both understood it was her way of closing a loop, of bringing herself, exactly as she had been when she spoke, back into the room where the final outcome would be decided. Ryan was already seated when we entered. He looked different this time, less curated, less certain. The suit was still there, the attempt at composure still visible, but something underneath it had shifted. Not remorse. I wasn't going to give him that without proof, but the confidence that had once held him together had thinned. He looked like a man who had run out of ways to explain himself. The judge entered. We stood. We sat. And then it began. There were no theatrics. No last-minute revelations. Just procedure. Ryan's attorney spoke first, asking for leniency. She described him as a young man who had made catastrophic mistakes under emotional strain. She emphasized his lack of prior record, his potential for rehabilitation, his supposed intention to repay the funds. She used words like misguided, overwhelmed, hopeful. It was a careful construction, a final attempt to reshape him into something softer than the evidence had proven. Then Ms. Chen spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not dismantle the defense point by point. She simply reminded the court of what had already been established. This was not a single lapse in judgment, she said. It was a sustained course of conduct. The defendant had repeated, explicit knowledge of the purpose of these funds. He chose to ignore that purpose over and over again. The victim was not only elderly, but actively undergoing treatment for a life-threatening illness. The defendant's actions deprived her of financial security during that period. That is precisely the kind of exploitation the elder abuse statute is designed to address. She sat down. Then the judge looked at Ryan. There was a long pause before he spoke, measured. The kind of pause that suggests the words have already been chosen, but the weight of them still deserves room. "Mr. Cole," he began, "in my years on this bench, I have seen many forms of theft." His voice was steady, not angry, not emotional, just tired in a way that comes from having seen too much of the same pattern play out under different names. I have seen theft driven by desperation, by addiction, by poor judgment under pressure. He leaned back slightly. Your case is not one of those. Ryan's hands tightened where they rested on the table. You did not take money in a moment of panic. You did not act under immediate threat or need. You engaged in a calculated pattern of behavior over an extended period of time. You had access to funds that were clearly designated for the care of a vulnerable individual. You understood that purpose. The judge's gaze didn't waver. And you chose to ignore it. The room felt very still. You watched the progression of a serious illness, he continued, and aligned your actions with what you believed to be the likely outcome of that illness. That is not negligence. That is not confusion. That is predation. The word landed harder than anything else had that morning. Predation. I felt my mother's hand tighten around my arm. You did not merely take money, the judge said. You took security. You took stability. You took the margin of hope that allowed this woman and her family to face an already devastating situation with some measure of protection. Ryan's head had lowered slightly, not in shame, in impact. This court cannot undo what has been done, the judge continued, but it can respond to it in a way that reflects the seriousness of your actions. Then the sentence. On the charge of grand theft, you are sentenced to 5 years. A ripple moved through the room. On the charge of financial elder abuse, you are sentenced to 10 years. These sentences will be served concurrently. 10 years. The number didn't echo. It settled. Heavy. Final. Behind us, someone let out a sharp, broken sound. I didn't turn, but I knew it was his family again. The same disbelief, just louder now. The same refusal to accept that what had happened had consequences matching its reality. Ryan didn't speak. He just sat there, staring forward, as if the number itself had hollowed something out of him. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely lost. Not misunderstood, not misrepresented. Lost. The bailiff moved to guide him away. And just like that, it was done. No music, no release, no sense of victory rising up to meet the moment. Just an ending. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, as if my body needed confirmation that there was nothing left to wait for. Then I felt my mother shift beside me. I turned. She was looking at me, not the door Ryan had just disappeared through. "Let's go home," she said softly. I nodded, and together we walked out of the courtroom. It's been almost a year. Long enough for the noise to fade, not long enough for the memory to soften. Time didn't heal this the way people like to promise it will. It didn't erase anything. It just rearranged the weight of it, moved it from something sharp and constant into something quieter, heavier, easier to carry, but impossible to put down completely. Ryan is in a state correctional facility now. I don't think about him often. Not in the way I used to think about him when he was still part of my life, as someone I planned around, someone I factored into decisions, someone I assumed would be there in the future I was building. Now, when he crosses my mind, it's brief. A closed chapter, a finished sentence. Nova Bloom Boutique collapsed within months of his arrest. Of course it did. Whatever illusion of success he had been chasing couldn't survive the reality of what funded it. The remaining accounts were seized for restitution, but the amount recovered was almost insulting compared to what had been taken. A fraction, a token gesture from a system that, for all its structure, still couldn't manufacture money that no longer existed. For a while, that part bothered me more than I expected. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted restoration. I wanted the fund to be whole again. I wanted to rewind to a version of my life where it still sat intact, waiting quietly to be used only if necessary. I wanted to undo the months where every withdrawal had been happening without my knowledge, where trust had been bleeding out in slow, invisible increments. But reality doesn't offer reversals, only responses. So we adapted. I picked up extra work. Longer hours, more projects. The kind of schedule I had once promised myself I would never return to. After my mother's diagnosis forced me to reevaluate what mattered. Friends stepped in too, in ways that still catch me off guard when I think about them. Quiet transfers, offers of help that didn't come with pity. My aunt organized a small fundraiser that my mother initially resisted, then accepted with a grace that made it clear she wasn't accepting charity. She was accepting community. Little by little, the Lifeline Fund began to exist again. Not as it was, but as something rebuilt, something chosen, this time, with full awareness of what trust can cost when it is misplaced. My mother is still in remission. That is the only sentence that matters. Her checkups are steady. Her strength has come back in ways I didn't dare hope for a year ago. She still gets tired more easily. She still has days where the shadow of what she went through lingers in her body. But she laughs more now, moves more freely, talks about things that aren't medical for longer stretches. We have coffee together in the morning sometimes, sitting in her sunroom with the windows open, the light falling across the table the way it used to before cancer turned everything clinical. Those are the moments I measure life by now. Not the courtroom, not the verdict, not even the sentence, just her being here. People still ask me about it. Not often, but enough. Usually it comes wrapped in careful language, like they're trying not to offend me while still satisfying their curiosity. Do you ever regret it? What you did, was it too much? Could you have handled it differently? There's always a pause after the question, like they're bracing for emotion, for doubt, for some complicated answer that acknowledges how messy these things can be. My answer has never changed. No. I don't say it harshly. I don't say it defensively. I say it the same way I said everything in court. Clearly. What Ryan did wasn't a mistake. Mistakes happen once. What he did happened over months. It wasn't confusion. He knew what the fund was for. He knew who it was for. He knew exactly what he was doing every time he moved money out of it. And it wasn't love. Love doesn't look at someone's illness and calculate opportunity. It doesn't stand close to vulnerability and see advantage. It doesn't recast someone else's fight for survival as a timeline for personal gain. What he did was a crime, a real one, against a real person. I didn't put him in prison. I didn't decide his sentence. I didn't twist anything or exaggerate anything or push the system beyond what it was designed to do. I reported what happened. Then I stepped back and let the facts take their full shape in a place built to recognize them. The outcome didn't come from me. It came from him. From every decision he made when he thought no one was watching, from every transfer he justified to himself, from every moment he chose to believe that proximity meant entitlement, that access meant ownership, that someone else's suffering could be converted into something useful for his own life. He arrived at that sentence long before the judge ever spoke it out loud. A year ago, I thought my life had been split into before and after, and it had, but not in the way I first believed. The earlier version of my life wasn't just about hope and trust. It was also about not knowing. Not knowing how quickly someone can change shape when you stop being useful to them. Not knowing how dangerous it is to confuse presence with integrity. Not knowing that the person holding your hand in the hospital hallway might also be quietly dismantling the safety net you built to survive that hallway. What came after isn't just colder, it's clearer. I trust differently now, not less, but with boundaries that have edges instead of assumptions. I still believe in partnership. I still believe in building a life with someone, but I no longer believe that love, by itself, guarantees safety. That's something you verify, something you protect, something you do not hand over casually. If there is any peace in all of this, it comes from one simple fact. My mother is here. She made it through the part that was supposed to break her. And everything else, the trial, the sentence, the loss, the rebuilding, exists in the shadow of that truth. We didn't get our old life back, but we kept the part that mattered most, and that was enough.